Welcome to the Legacy Prep Coach podcast. This is Derek Dogner, your host, and it's where I break down bodybuilding, prep, peak week, and performance-based nutrition. Today I'm going to walk you through a peak that sounds a little crazy and unconventional on the surface, but it shows exactly how I think as a coach. I had a bodybuilder who drank over 2.5 gallons of whole A2 milk across 3 days, and that strategy helped him earn that elusive IFBB Pro card. Now, before you think I've lost my damn mind, let me clear something up right away. This was not random. This was a very specific strategy for a very specific athlete, and it only worked because I knew that athlete extremely well. This is not something that I would recommend for just anyone. But this athlete's name was Nick Langer. And before we ever started working together, Nick had already worked with a lot of high-level coaches. So this was not a beginner where all we had to do was clean up a couple basic variables and suddenly everything just clicked. Nick had already been a high-level amateur for a very long time. And before we got that pro card, we had already worked together for about 5 years. And during that time, we had a lot of success together. Multiple overalls. We won a junior national title. We had top 4 at USA's as well as the Amateur Olympia. So our foundation was really strong. But when you get to that level and trying to get to the next level, the game changes. You're not trying to fix, generally at least, not trying to fix a giant obvious problem anymore. You're just trying to figure out and solve that one thing that's keeping an already elite athlete and physique from sealing the deal and crossing that finish line. And for Nick, that problem was pretty simple to describe, but it was honestly pretty challenging to solve. And for him, it was getting the glutes all the way in from the back, because this was never a conditioning issue for him. Nick was always in shape. Always. Not a fat loss issue. He didn't need more cardio. He didn't need more suffering. Didn't need to pull off another 5 pounds. For him, it really came down to fluid distribution. And he just held all of his fluid in his glutes. And Nick's got big glutes, so we knew the muscle density was there. We just had to figure out a way to get that fluid out of there. And if you've coached long enough, you've probably ran into this situation before, and you know how frustrating it can be, because that standard bodybuilding answer is usually the same. Just pull water, you'll be good. Or throw him a Diazide or a diuretic, dry him out a little harder. And for Nick, that approach just wouldn't work. If we pulled water too hard or used something like a diuretic, he would just get really flat. And then if we tried to fill him out, if he got flat and tried to fill him out with a bunch of food, he'd lose midsection control. And Nick is somebody where you got to be a little bit careful with that food volume anyways, because structurally he's not the most blessed. And he also has had hernia surgery, so he lacked a little bit of control through that midsection as he was recovering still from that surgery. So when you have an athlete in that situation, you pull the water and now they're flatter, you feed them up and now they're not quite as tight. It's not solving the problem, right? It's just kind of shifting things around. But we did have a really big breakthrough when we peaked him for the Amateur Olympia and USA's. During that time, we started experimenting with really increasing potassium, and we got a pretty fast and dramatic response. Like, he was definitely a hyper responder. And it really improved his look. It was definitely his best look by far and his best placings. But we didn't fully solve the issue. We were definitely better. We were not just all the way there yet. And that's when I stopped looking at this as like a few isolated peak week variables and started to try to view this as more of a whole system. And that system is really just electrolyte balance and studying that a little bit deeper. Because electrolytes are not equal. They don't work like a shopping list where you just check the boxes and call it good. They work from a top-down system. So you got your sodium and you got your potassium. Those are always the ones that we consider in bodybuilding. But calcium and magnesium are also really, really important. And that's what I'm going to dive into a little bit deeper here today. But let's start with the first one, which is sodium. So sodium acts more like a gatekeeper. If sodium is not in the right amount, that plasma volume drops, that nerve transmission drops, glucose transport gets worse, amino acid delivery gets worse. So when that plasma volume drops, that's providing fullness to the tissue. If nerve transmission drops, probably don't have as good of contractions through the tissue. Glucose transport gets worse. Well, now we're not partitioning our carb up as efficiently, right? Amino acid delivery, not quite as important on a peak week, but within training and performance-based nutrition, absolutely critical. So something to be mindful of just for optimizing your gym training. But when we see people that go super low sodium and think they're like getting tighter or looking better, what often usually happens is they get flat, weak, and again, less able to utilize those carbohydrates efficiently. There's definitely a time and a place to adjust sodium for sure. I absolutely do this with athletes, but slashing it too aggressively or too early, a lot of times just makes the look worse. Okay. Next, we got potassium. So potassium is a huge part of whether that muscle can keep firing. So when we think about this in training, we think about like quality contractions and the repeatability of those contractions. But on stage, the way I view this is whether that athlete fades through prejudging, because low potassium doesn't always show up right away. Like that athlete might come out looking really, really good. But as prejudging goes on, their posing might start slipping. They could start cramping, maybe sweating a little bit more, or just in general, they fade, right? They can't sustain that look. And that, again, is usually an electrical issue. And this is why sodium and potassium, they're not opposites, they're partners. They're going to work together. But sodium is going to help with the extracellular volume, and potassium helps with the intracellular excitability and, again, the ability to repeat those contractions. So if sodium's high but potassium's low, you may get delivery, but that tissue can't keep firing. And again, a lot of times we'll see that athlete fade. If potassium's high, though, and sodium's low, that cell might be excitable, but they're usually flat. So again, that balance is really important. It's not about extremes. It's just about finding that right balance for the individual. And this will be different individual to individual. So this is where practice peaks come in, and just simply knowing your athlete and trialing some of these things. Now, the next one is calcium. And this is where things got kind of interesting for me, because most people, like your Gen Pop, are going to think calcium is like a bone mineral, right? And then somebody that's a little bit more versed in like performance-based nutrition might understand that calcium helps a lot with force production. But calcium is so much deeper and is so much more important than just that. Calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and I am going to get a little nerdy here, but it's going to allow that actin and myosin cross-bridging to happen. Okay. So in plain English, that just means calcium is part of what allows muscles to actually produce force and contract properly. So if calcium release is poor, your contraction quality is going to be poor. If contraction quality is poor, the athlete's going to have a lot harder time fully expressing that physique on stage because they're having a hard time connecting with that muscle. I often see individuals with really, really low calcium within their diet, within their carb up, and so on and so forth, dropping poses on stage. They definitely usually drop their legs, right? They have trouble keeping their quads on, or their hams, or their glutes. And this is like a really big issue, because you could be super in shape, super lean, have an amazing physique, but if you don't show it, you're not going to get judged as well as you should. So calcium, again, it does a lot more than just help create force. It's also a signaling molecule inside the cell. So it can help open and close those ion channels in the cell membrane. And those channels, they regulate movement of things like your sodium and potassium. And when ions move, what's called osmotic pressure, that changes. And when osmotic pressure changes, that water follows. So now calcium is not just helping that muscle contract, it's also indirectly helping control water movement into and out of that cell. And that matters a lot for peak week, because when you're really trying to nail a look, you are not just trying to dry someone out. You're trying to control where that water is sitting. And that's going to kind of control the look of that muscle, right? So that's a big difference. And once I really leaned into this and started understanding it a little bit better, calcium became a much bigger part of the conversation for me. Okay. The next one is magnesium. Now, this is one of the major positive ions inside the cell, second to potassium. Okay. So potassium and sodium are always going to be your number ones, but magnesium is still very important. And it's going to contribute to that total internal solute environment, which helps determine how water moves by osmosis. So now magnesium is not the main osmotic driver. Again, it's not the star of the show the way sodium and potassium are, but it helps to maintain that internal environment that keeps water distribution stable. And that is one of its biggest roles. The other thing with magnesium is that it binds to ATP. And that is the active form used by your enzymes. And that matters because that sodium potassium pump, which again we emphasize a lot, depends on your magnesium to AP or magnesium ATP. Okay. And that pump is one of the most important systems in the whole body for moving sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. That pump maintains osmotic gradients. Okay. And because water follows sodium, your magnesium is going to indirectly help control water movement by keeping that pump working efficiently. So super, super important. So when people think magnesium is just a sleep mineral or something you take if you're cramping up, it's a pretty shallow way of looking at it, right? Think of a magnesium as creating stability. It helps keep that whole electrical and fluid system under control. And this is where that relationship between calcium and magnesium, it really starts to matter because calcium and magnesium, again, they don't work separately. They work as a pair. Calcium helps a lot with activation. Magnesium helps a lot with stability. Magnesium will control the speed. Okay. So that balance matters because it helps determine ion movement, and ion movement determines water movement. So when calcium rises, your ion channels can open more easily. That can increase sodium and calcium influx into the cell. So as intracellular solutes increase, water follows. If that goes unchecked, it can start getting swelling, stress, just poor water distribution, or simply a look that is just a little off. They're not quite sure what it is. A lot of times, this is the variables that are being missed. So when magnesium is sufficient, though, it helps limit that excessive calcium entry. It helps keep those channels from overactivating. It helps support that sodium-potassium pump, which then helps move sodium out and potassium in. And that helps, again, prevent this water influx and helps keep hydration more stable too. This is also a way that we're able to dry out more efficiently without having the negative consequences of that. So the calcium magnesium balance is going to play a really big role in whether that cell gains water, loses water, or stays in a more stable place. That is not like a tiny detail. It's definitely a nerdy one. I know I went off a little bit there, but this is a very real part of why athletes can look really full, crisp, and just like nailed their peak, right? Or just look a little off, a little stressed, a little puffy, a little watery, or maybe just fade fast on stage. And to me, when we think about bodybuilding peaking, this is an overlooked piece. This is not really discussed often. So once I understood, like looking back, once I understood how Nick responded to potassium, this is when I started experimenting with calcium and magnesium and really dialing in that relationship between sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Now, when we think about the details I'm going to give you with Nick, the numbers that I use, they're not universal. Okay. Body size matters, sex matters, PED use matters, muscle mass matters. You got to scale this to the athlete. And there's really one way to do that. And that's just by getting in the trenches and seeing what works. But for him, I honestly just held sodium around 7 grams pretty consistently. There were meals closer to stage where I did titrate it up a little bit to increase that cell volume and that fullness, but for the most part, sodium stayed pretty stable. Potassium, however, I started about 9 grams, so slightly above his sodium intake, and then I scaled this up over those 3 days to be closer to like 14, and I think we even peaked at about 16 grams. So, similar to like a 2-to-1 potassium to sodium ratio, I've always found to be a really good sweet spot for Nick with water distribution, just based off our history. Calcium, I dialed in at about 3 grams, and magnesium was roughly 1 to 1.2. And this is how that A2 milk strategy, where Nick drank over 2.5 gallons of whole milk over 3 days, was created. Now, this sounds a little, again, insane if you strip it out of context, but in context, it makes a lot of sense. And let me describe that a little bit deeper. So first, Nick digests dairy and milk proteins incredibly well, actually better than he digests animal proteins. Sometimes animal proteins would cause him a little bit more distension. So the milk wasn't just giving us like electrolytes, it was giving us additional nutrients, which help us utilize all our food efficiently, but it was also helping us hit our protein goals while keeping his waist tighter, not making his waist worse. Typically we would think of, hey, we're drinking a bunch of milk, that's going to bloat him. But if you know your athlete well, you're going to know which foods work for him. And for Nick, I just knew this was a good choice. Second, I used whole milk with Nick because we've always had to peak him with a lot of fats. When he's that lean, you give him carbs, he just burns through food so fast and he can't hold fullness. So milk made sense because it not only gave us calcium and potassium and even some of his protein requirements for the day, but also the fats that we needed to slow down and keep him fuller, or slow that rate of burn down and keep him fuller. And then third, milk was just a really practical way to push calcium and potassium higher. So instead of trying to force all this through a bunch of like disconnected inputs or like supplementation or potassium chloride, we just had a food source that fit really, really well with the athlete and solved multiple problems at once. And there was another important layer to this. So at the start of the peaking process, he was having milk and water. He was having like a good bit of fluid. Nick is a guy that likes to drink a lot of water through his prep, usually over 2 gallons. So he was used to drinking a lot of fluid. So we started with having water and milk basically with each meal. Now, as we moved through the peak, I basically just kept the milk the same, so I would keep that electrolyte balance the same. And I started reducing that water, and then I eventually eliminated water completely and just used milk as his hydration source. And that mattered for a few reasons. One, milk was still providing plenty of fluid, plenty of key electrolytes, that he stayed very, very hydrated. And two, it reduced the added water volume, and his stomach was actually much, much tighter, not having so much fluid coming in. And that was just a beautiful look for, especially for Nick, again, with his history of having the surgeries and stuff. The midsection control was a really big emphasis for us. So this just ended up working out pretty perfect. And then again, when you think about this, people hear and assume you drinking a bunch of milk, that waistline's going to be so bloated, but it actually made his waistline tighter, which is kind of crazy. So the milk stayed, the extra water gradually came down and was eliminated, and the benefit was a much tighter presentation of his midsection on stage. And that, to me, that's what real peaking looks like. It's not about one crazy variable. It's about how the variables all fit together. And that's also why I think a lot of traditional peaks miss. They focus too heavily on some surface level things, more carbs, less water, diuretics, less sodium. They kind of hope for the best. But if this electrical system is not working, if water distribution is off, if we're not taking into consideration that calcium and magnesium relationship, the athlete is not going to express their best look, even if like the food looks perfect on paper. And that's why flatness in a lot of athletes too, it's not a glycogen issue. Flatness can reflect low intracellular potassium, poor sodium driven transport, impaired calcium release, and just bad water distribution. So that's why athletes can also eat a lot of carbs and again, just still look flat, because they don't have this foundation that allows you to utilize that glucose efficiently and put it in the right spot. So the fuel is there, but the system just can't use it well. And this is why I view electrolyte balance as something that should be in a good place probably before you even start carb loading. So something to, again, figure it out before you even get into that peak week process. You should be setting these foundations weeks in advance. Same thing with cramping too. Cramping is usually not random. It's force output. If force output is high, ionic turnover is high, and intake is not scaling with it. That's how, again, you usually show it fading, having poor contractions, sweating, and then a lot of times even full on cramping on stage. So the biggest takeaway here that I want you to come away with is that not everyone should go and drink milk before the show. Like that would be like not the most intelligent takeaway from this. The real lesson is that the best results usually come when you stop forcing an athlete into a template and start building the peak around the athlete in front of you. For Nick, pulling harder just wasn't the answer, but understanding his response pattern, and I did this over time, right? Like we had 5 years before we really put this piece together, and that led to me learning more about the electrolyte balance and respecting the electrolyte work as a system. And that ended up being the answer for him. And I just was willing to use a tool that looked a little unconventional from the outside, but made a lot of sense for him. That was the answer. That to me is real coaching. Anybody can copy a template. Anybody can push a freak across the finish line. But when you take somebody who maybe doesn't have the easiest path, somebody who has to work 10 times harder, and you actually take the time to learn them deeply enough over the years, and they keep improving and they finally break through, that's special. And this moment was very, very special to me. And those are the moments that I live for as a coach. And I know it was just as rewarding for Nick. And that's why the story matters to me, not because the strategy looked crazy, but who I did it with, because of the precision of knowing him and the trust that he had in me. It's a fun story to tell, but it really just comes down to knowing your athlete extremely well. And that takes real coaching, real time, and a real ability to build a relationship. So with that said, that's it for the episode of Legacy Prep Coach Podcast. If you enjoyed the content, please leave a link or a comment. Let me know what you think and what you'd like me to cover next.